The fluorescent lights in the Senate chamber hummed with an electric tension that had nothing to do with the circuits powering them. The long, rectangular room with its rich mahogany paneling and deep blue carpet seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation that pressed against the chests of the 300 spectators who had packed themselves into every available seat. The gallery above the main floor was standing room only. Journalists and staffers and curious citizens pressed shoulder to shoulder, their faces illuminated by the glow of phone screens and the occasional camera flash. Below them, on the Senate floor itself, the semicircular arrangement of desks radiated outward from the central dais like the spokes of a wheel, each one occupied by a senator who understood that today was not an ordinary day of legislative business. Today was something else entirely. Today was a reckoning that had been 40 years in the making. Hillary Rodham Clinton sat at the witness table positioned in the well of the chamber, her powder blue pantsuit immaculate, the fabric crisp and unwrinkled despite the summer heat that the ancient air conditioning system struggled to combat. Her hands were folded with the practiced patience of someone who had spent 4 decades in rooms exactly like this one, who had testified before Congress more times than she could count, who knew every procedural rule and every parliamentary trick, who understood the rhythms of power and how to manipulate them to her advantage. She knew how to wait. She knew how to control her expression, how to project calm authority even when the questions turned hostile, how to use silence as a weapon and her voice as a shield. But today, something was different. Today, she could feel it in the air, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that she couldn't quite name, a vibration that ran beneath the surface of the formal proceedings like a current beneath ice. The Democratic senators who had invited her were unusually quiet, their usual bonhomie and backslapping replaced by a nervous energy that manifested in fidgeting hands and averted eyes. The Republican senators were watching her with an intensity that went beyond the usual partisan hostility, their gazes sharp and focused in a way that made her skin prickle with unease. And at the front of the chamber, presiding over the proceedings with an almost eerie stillness that seemed to absorb the ambient noise of the room, sat Vice President J.D. Vance. He hadn't looked at her once since she'd entered the chamber 45 minutes ago. Not once. He sat behind the elevated desk reserved for the presiding officer, reviewing documents with the methodical focus of a prosecutor preparing for the trial of the century, his pen moving across legal pads in short, precise strokes, his expression revealing nothing, his dark hair falling slightly over his forehead in a way that gave him the appearance of a scholar deep in study rather than a politician preparing for combat. Hillary recognized the tactic immediately, appeared disinterested, refused to acknowledge the opponent's importance. Let them wonder what you're thinking. She had used it herself countless times over her long career, deploying it against upstart challengers and hostile reporters and rival politicians who thought they could rattle her composure. But something about Vance's stillness bothered her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't the nervousness of someone unprepared, the frantic energy of a man out of his depth trying to bluff his way through a high-stakes confrontation. It was the patience of someone who had all the time in the world, because he already knew how this would end. It was the confidence of a man who had done his homework, who had spent months preparing for this exact moment, who had compiled the evidence and organized the arguments, and was now simply waiting for the right moment to deploy them with devastating precision. She pushed the thought away with a mental shake, dismissing it as pre-hearing jitters. This was her arena. She had been playing this game since before Vance was born, since before his mother was even an adult. She had survived the crucible of the Watergate investigation as a young staffer, had endured the public humiliation of her husband's impeachment, had weathered the storm of countless investigations and accusations and scandals that would have destroyed lesser politicians. She was here to remind everyone why she should have been president, to demonstrate that she was still the most formidable figure in American politics, to eviscerate the hillbilly vice president on national television in a way that would dominate the news cycle for weeks and cement her status as the elder stateswoman who had put an arrogant young pretender in his place. She had the lines prepared, polished to a razor's edge through weeks of rehearsal. She had practiced in front of mirrors in her Chappaqua home, in front of aides who knew better than to offer criticism, in front of friendly journalists who had promised to amplify the best moments on their platforms. You've written about poverty, Mr. Vice President, but you've never actually done anything about it. You called your own candidate reprehensible. What does that make you for serving him? The clips would be devastating. The contrast would be perfect. The experienced stateswoman versus the inexperienced pretender. The woman who had negotiated treaties and managed crises and represented America on the world stage versus the man who had written a memoir and then spent 4 years enabling everything he once claimed to oppose. Chairman Menendez called the hearing to order, his voice echoing through the packed chamber with a slight tremor that betrayed his own nervousness. Every seat was filled. Every camera was rolling. The major networks had interrupted their regular programming to carry this live, and the cable news channels had been promoting it for days as the confrontation of the century. This was the most anticipated congressional hearing in months, perhaps years, and everyone knew why. The Democrats wanted Hillary on the national stage. They wanted her to destroy Vance, to wound the administration, to remind voters what they had rejected in 2016 and what they might embrace again in future elections. And Hillary was ready. She leaned into her microphone for her opening statement, her voice carrying the weight of 4 decades in public service, the timbre rich and authoritative, the pacing measured and deliberate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here today to discuss American leadership in a rapidly changing world. But before I address the specific policy questions before this committee, I feel compelled to address the broader context in which we find ourselves. She paused, letting the moment breathe, her eyes sweeping across the chamber to make eye contact with key senators, to acknowledge the cameras, to command the attention that she had earned through years of public performance. She had delivered thousands of speeches, tens of thousands of statements, and she knew exactly how to work a room, how to modulate her tone to convey gravitas, how to use body language to project confidence and authority. American leadership is not a given. It must be earned, maintained, and defended. It requires experience. It requires judgment. It requires a deep understanding of how the world works and how America can shape it for the better. Her gaze drifted toward Vance, still absorbed in his papers, his pen moving steadily across his legal pad. Time to draw first blood. Unfortunately, we live in an era when experience is devalued, when expertise is dismissed, when people with no understanding of the complexities of global affairs are placed in positions of enormous responsibility. Still, Vance didn't look up. Hillary felt a flicker of irritation that she quickly suppressed. He should be reacting by now. He should be looking defensive or angry or at least engaged. But he just kept reviewing his documents as if she were reciting grocery lists instead of delivering carefully crafted attacks on national television. She pressed forward, her voice sharpening slightly, the edge of steel that had intimidated countless opponents over the years. I've spent 40 years in public service. I've sat across from world leaders on every continent. I've negotiated treaties, managed crises, represented this country in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. I've made hard decisions with imperfect information, knowing that lives hung in the balance. Now she turned directly toward him, abandoning subtlety for the direct strike, her body language shifting to confrontational. So, I hope the Vice President will forgive me if I'm somewhat skeptical of those who believe that writing a memoir qualifies them to be a heartbeat from the presidency. A ripple of reaction went through the chamber, a murmur of approval from the Democratic side, a shifting in seats from the Republicans. This was what everyone had come to see. This was the moment the cable news promos had promised. Finally, Vance looked up from his papers. His expression was mild, almost pleasant, as if she had just offered him a compliment rather than a direct attack on his qualifications. Please continue, Mrs. Clinton. I'm listening. The calmness in his voice should have been her first warning, the red flag that signaled danger ahead. But Hillary was committed now, momentum carrying her forward like a river that had already passed the point where it could change course. For the next 45 minutes, she delivered the performance she had rehearsed, the greatest hits of her career, narrative interwoven with sharp jabs at her opponent. She lectured about the importance of experience, about the dangers of populism, about the need for serious people to guide American foreign policy. Every point was an implicit criticism of Vance, but delivered with the appearance of statesmanlike wisdom, the condescending tone of a professor explaining basic concepts to a struggling student. She discussed her tenure as Secretary of State, painting herself as the steady hand, the experienced operator, the adult in the room who had navigated the treacherous waters of international diplomacy while others played politics. Then she moved to the direct attacks, each one designed to go viral, each one crafted to make Vance look small while she appeared gracious and magnanimous. Mr. Vice President, I've read your book, Hillbilly Elegy. It's an interesting personal story, but I couldn't help noticing that your prescription for poverty was essentially to blame the poor for their circumstances. Personal responsibility, you called it. She shook her head with practiced disappointment, the gesture calculated to convey sorrow rather than anger. That's a convenient philosophy for those who have escaped poverty, but it does nothing for those still trapped in it. You wrote about your community's problems, Mr. Vice President. What have you actually done to solve them? Vance made a note on his legal pad. Nothing more. No defensive response, no angry rebuttal, just a brief notation and then his eyes back on his papers. Hillary pulled out a sheet of paper, the one her staff had prepared with all of Vance's contradictory statements about Trump, the opposition research that had been compiled over weeks of digging through archives and interview transcripts. This was the kill shot, the moment that would define the hearing and generate the clips that would be played on loop for days. And then there's your rather dramatic political evolution. I remember 2016 quite well, as you might imagine, and I remember some of the things you said about Donald Trump. She read from the paper, her voice taking on the cadence of a prosecutor presenting evidence. You called him America's Hitler. Your words, not mine. You said he was noxious and reprehensible, and you said he was leading the white working class to a very dark place. She looked up, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. Strong words, principled words, one might even say. And yet here you are, 4 years later, his vice president, his loyal servant, defending everything you once condemned. Hillary spread her hands in a gesture of bewilderment that she had practiced in front of the mirror until it looked spontaneous. What happened, Mr. Vice President? Did you have a genuine change of heart? Or did you simply decide that principles were less important than power? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the latter. It looks like you said whatever was necessary to advance your career, regardless of what you actually believed. She leaned forward for the final thrust, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that the microphones picked up perfectly. That's not leadership. That's opportunism, and the American people deserve better. Vance continued to take notes, his pen moving steadily across the page. His silence was becoming unnerving, a void that seemed to absorb her attacks without echo. Why wasn't he reacting? Why wasn't he defending himself? This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He should be angry, flustered, defensive. He should be making mistakes that she could exploit. But he just kept writing, his expression neutral, his composure intact. But she was too far in to stop now. She pressed on, attacking his views on Ukraine, his skepticism about international alliances, his dangerous isolationism that threatened to undo decades of American leadership. She painted him as naive, inexperienced, unqualified for the office he held, a danger to the republic who had stumbled into power through luck and opportunism rather than merit. Mr. Vice President, I don't doubt your intelligence. I don't doubt your ambition. But intelligence and ambition are not the same as wisdom and experience. You've never managed a crisis. You've never negotiated with a foreign adversary. You've never made a decision knowing that American lives were on the line. She gestured around the chamber with the authority of someone who had earned the right to judge, her arms sweeping to encompass the history of the room, the weight of the institution, the gravity of the moment. I have. For 40 years I have. And that's the difference between us. That's why your presence in the office you hold is so deeply troubling to those of us who understand what's at stake. She sat back, satisfied with her performance, her posture relaxed but still commanding. I hope you'll take these concerns in the spirit they're offered as honest counsel from someone who has seen what inexperience can cost. The world is watching, Mr. Vice President. I hope you're ready for the weight of that responsibility. The applause came from the Democratic side of the chamber, just as she had expected, a smattering of approval that grew into a sustained ovation. Senators Warren and Booker were practically beaming, their faces glowing with the satisfaction of seeing their rival cut down to size. The media gallery was typing furiously, the sound of fingers on keyboards like rain on a roof. She could already see the headlines. Hillary destroys Vance. Clinton schools vice president on leadership. The reckoning. She folded her hands on the table and allowed herself a small smile, the expression of someone who had just checkmated an opponent who had never seen the move coming. She had done what she came here to do. She had reminded everyone why she was the most qualified candidate who had ever run for president, why the country had made a mistake in rejecting her, why she was still the standard-bearer for the Democratic Party and the conscience of the nation. At the presiding chair, J.D. Vance set down his pen. "Are you finished, Mrs. Clinton?" Hillary's smile was gracious, magnanimous in victory, the smile of a cat who had cornered a particularly slow and stupid mouse. "I believe I've made my points." "You have, very thoroughly." Vance stood and walked to the front of the dais, carrying several folders with him, his movements unhurried, his gait steady and confident. "And I appreciate your candor. It makes what I'm about to do much easier." Something in his tone made Hillary's smile falter, a slight crack in her composure that she quickly plastered over with a raised eyebrow of skepticism. It wasn't anger in his voice. It wasn't defensiveness. It was something else entirely, something calm and deliberate and utterly devoid of fear. "You've raised questions about my experience, my qualifications, my judgment." Vance continued, his voice conversational but carrying clearly through the suddenly silent chamber, the acoustics of the room amplifying every word. "You've suggested that I'm not ready for the responsibilities of high office, that I don't understand the weight of decisions that affect American lives." He set the folders on the desk in front of him and opened the first one with deliberate care, his fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon selecting instruments. "So, let's talk about experience. Let's talk about judgment. Let's talk about decisions that affect American lives." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers directly for the first time since she had entered the room, and in that gaze, Hillary felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Let's talk about Benghazi." The chamber went silent, completely, utterly silent. The typing in the media gallery stopped mid-keystroke. The shuffling of papers ceased. Even the air conditioning seemed to quiet, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Hillary felt her spine stiffen, her body going into the defensive posture she had developed over years of hostile questioning. She had known Benghazi might come up. She had prepared responses, the same responses she had given to countless committees, countless reporters, countless hostile questioners over the years. She knew how to deflect, how to reframe, how to make the questioner look partisan and petty, how to invoke the fog of war and the tragedy of loss and the unfairness of politicizing the deaths of brave Americans. But something about the way Vance was arranging his documents on the desk made her stomach tighten, a visceral reaction that bypassed her rational mind. He wasn't grandstanding. He wasn't playing to the cameras with theatrical gestures or raised voices. He was methodical, almost clinical, like a surgeon preparing for a complex operation or a prosecutor laying out the evidence for a capital case. September 11th, 2012. Vance began, his voice steady and factual, devoid of emotion but heavy with implication. The American diplomatic compound in Benghazi, Libya, was attacked by armed militants. Ambassador Chris Stevens, Information Officer Sean Smith, and CIA contractors Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty were killed. They were the first American ambassador killed in the line of duty since 1979. He held up a document, letting the camera zoom in on it, the projection screen behind him displaying the image in high definition for the entire chamber to see. In the months before that attack, the State Department, your State Department, Mrs. Clinton, received approximately 600 requests for additional security in Libya. The security situation was deteriorating. Ambassador Stevens himself sent cables warning of the danger. Vance looked directly at Hillary, his eyes unblinking, his expression unreadable. How many of those requests were approved? Hillary leaned into her microphone, her voice measured and controlled, the tone she used when she wanted to convey patience with foolish questions. Security decisions were made by professionals within the department based on their assessment of the situation on the ground and the resources available. That's not what I asked. Vance's voice cut through her response with surgical precision, sharp and clean and final. I asked how many of the 600 requests for additional security were approved. Do you know the answer? Silence. Hillary's mouth opened, then closed. The rehearsed deflections suddenly felt inadequate, like bringing a knife to a gunfight. I'll help you, Vance said quietly, his voice dropping to a register that forced the chamber to lean in to hear. Very few. The requests were denied. Some of them he held up several cables, the paper thick with official stamps and signatures. Bear your signature or the signature of officials reporting directly to you. He set down the cables with deliberate care, each one landing with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the silence. Ambassador Stevens requested more security. He was denied. He asked again, denied again. He warned that the situation was deteriorating. Denied. And then he died. Hillary tried to respond, her voice rising slightly with the first hint of defensiveness. The security situation in Libya was complex, and the Accountability Review Board conducted a thorough investigation and made recommendations that were implemented. Let's talk about the night of the attack. Vance interrupted again, his voice still calm, still controlled, but now with an edge of steel beneath the surface. He pulled out more documents, arranging them in a neat row on the desk. The assault began at approximately 9:40 p.m. local time. By 10:00 p.m. Washington time, the State Department Operations Center had informed the White House and senior officials that the compound was under attack. He held up an email, the header clearly visible on the projection screen behind him, the timestamp glowing in the fluorescent light. At 11:12 p.m., you sent an email to your daughter, Chelsea. The email said, and I quote, "2 of our officers were killed in Benghazi by an al-Qaeda-like group." Vance looked up from the email, his eyes boring into Hillary's with an intensity that made her want to look away, to break the contact, to find somewhere else to focus. But she couldn't. She was trapped in his gaze like a specimen on a slide. Al-Qaeda. You knew that night, within hours of the attack, that it was terrorism. Al-Qaeda. Not a protest. Not a spontaneous demonstration over a YouTube video. A planned terrorist attack by an al-Qaeda-like group. He set down the email and picked up another document, his movements unhurried, giving each piece of evidence its moment in the spotlight. And yet the next day, and for weeks afterward, you and other administration officials blamed a YouTube video. You said the attack was a spontaneous protest over an anti-Islamic film. You said there was no evidence of a planned terrorist assault. He pulled out a photograph, and Hillary's stomach dropped, a physical sensation of falling that made her grip the edge of the table. She knew what it was before he even spoke, the image already burned into her memory from years of nightmares and damage control sessions. On September 14, 2012, 3 days after the attack, you stood at Andrews Air Force Base as the bodies of the 4 Americans were brought home. You spoke to the families. Vance's voice grew harder, each word landing like a hammer on an anvil, the sound carrying to every corner of the chamber. And according to multiple family members, you told them that you would bring the filmmaker to justice. He looked directly at her, and in that moment Hillary understood that she had walked into an ambush, that the room she thought was her arena had become her courtroom, that the man she had dismissed as an inexperienced pretender had become her judge and executioner. Patricia Smith, Sean Smith's mother, has stated publicly, repeatedly, that you told her the video was responsible, that you promised to prosecute the filmmaker. Charles Woods, Tyrone Woods' father, says you told him the same thing. Vance's voice filled the chamber, resonating off the marble walls and the high ceiling. You knew it was al-Qaeda. You wrote that in an email to your own daughter the night of the attack. And then you looked grieving mothers and fathers in the eye while their sons lay dead in flag-draped coffins, and you blamed a filmmaker. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the desk, his posture relaxed but his gaze intense. Why did you lie to them, Mrs. Clinton? Hillary's face had gone pale, the blood draining from her cheeks, her hands, usually so steady, trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass, the condensation leaving a wet ring on the polished wood. The intelligence was still being assessed. There were multiple conflicting reports coming in from various sources, and the situation was fluid. You told your daughter it was Al-Qaeda the night it happened. Vance's voice was relentless, a tide that kept coming regardless of her attempts to build barriers. What intelligence were you still assessing? You already knew, and you lied to the families of the dead. He gathered the Benghazi documents and set them aside with the care of an archivist handling precious manuscripts, then reached for another folder, the movement causing Hillary's breath to catch in her throat. You lectured me about experience, about the weight of decisions that affect American lives, about the responsibility of high office. He held up the emails, the cables, the security requests, fanning them out like a dealer displaying a winning hand of cards. 4 Americans died on your watch because your department denied their security requests. And then you lied to their families about why they died. You lied while standing next to their coffins. You lied to grieving mothers who just wanted to know why their sons were gone. Vance's voice dropped lower, more intense, the quiet somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. That's your experience, Mrs. Clinton. That's your judgment. That's your record. He set down the Benghazi folder with a finality that echoed through the silent chamber, the sound like a door closing. Then he reached for the next folder, and Hillary felt her carefully constructed defenses beginning to crumble like sandcastles before a rising tide. Now, Vance said, his voice still calm, still methodical, let's talk about your emails. Hillary had expected Benghazi. She had weathered Benghazi before, survived multiple congressional hearings, countless news cycles, years of Republican attacks that she had always managed to deflect or survive. But she could feel something different about this confrontation, something that went beyond the usual partisan theater. Vance wasn't attacking. He was documenting. He wasn't making accusations. He was presenting evidence. And the distinction made all the difference, turning what should have been a familiar exercise in political combat into something that felt more like a trial. Vance opened the new folder with the same deliberate calm, the same methodical precision. When you became Secretary of State in 2009, you made an unusual decision. Instead of using the State Department's secure email system, the system designed specifically to protect classified information from foreign adversaries, you set up a private email server in the basement of your home in Chappaqua, New York. He held up a photograph that appeared on the screen behind him, the image showing a nondescript house with a server rack visible through a basement window. This server, maintained by a private company without the security protocols required for government communications, was used for all of your official State Department correspondence. Tens of thousands of emails, 4 years of the nation's diplomacy, on a server in your basement. Hillary shook her head, reaching for her prepared response, the talking points she had memorized years ago. This has been extensively investigated. The FBI conducted a thorough review and concluded that no reasonable prosecutor would bring charges. It has been investigated. Vance pulled out a thick report, the cover clearly visible, the seal of the Department of Justice embossed in gold. Let me tell you what those investigations found. FBI Director James Comey stated that 110 emails on your server contained classified information at the time they were sent or received, not retroactively classified. Classified at the time. 110 emails. He turned pages deliberately, letting each fact settle before moving to the next, the rhythm of his presentation hypnotic in its thoroughness. Of those, 8 email chains contained information classified at the top secret level, the highest level of classification. Information that, if compromised, could cause exceptionally grave damage to national security. Vance looked up, his gaze unwavering. On an unsecured server in your basement. He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in, giving the chamber time to absorb the magnitude of what he was describing. Director Comey described your handling of this classified information as, and I quote, extremely careless. Those were his exact words, not mine, not a political opponent. The FBI director's words, extremely careless. Hillary attempted to interject, her voice tight with the effort of maintaining composure. Director Comey also said that no reasonable prosecutor would bring charges, which is true. That's true. Vance nodded, acknowledging the point without conceding it. But do you know why, Mrs. Clinton? He pulled out more documents, his movements precise and unhurried, the pace of his revelation maddening in its control. Because proving intent in these cases is difficult. Because the standard for prosecuting a former Secretary of State is different than the standard for prosecuting an ordinary government employee. Because political considerations inevitably affected the decision. He set down the FBI report and looked directly at her, his expression unchanged, neither triumphant nor angry, simply stating facts. But let's be clear about what you did. You compromised classified information, including top-secret information, by storing it on an unsecured private server. If any of the people who work for me had done that, they would have lost their security clearances immediately. They would have been fired. They might well be in prison. Vance pulled out another document, a technical report with diagrams and charts. And then there's what happened when you got caught. Hillary felt her throat tighten, a physical constriction that made swallowing difficult. She knew what was coming. She had lived through it, had watched the news coverage, had endured the jokes and the memes and the endless investigations. In March 2015, the House Select Committee on Benghazi issued a subpoena for all emails related to Libya. He held up the subpoena, the legal document heavy with official seals and signatures. You were legally required to preserve and produce those documents. He set down the subpoena and picked up a technical report, the pages filled with technical jargon about data deletion and forensic recovery. Instead, approximately 33,000 emails were deleted. Your staff used a program called BleachBit to ensure they couldn't be recovered. Mobile devices that had contained your emails were destroyed, some of them with hammers. Vance's eyes never left Hillary's face, watching her reactions, cataloging her responses. Destroying evidence after receiving a subpoena is obstruction of justice, Mrs. Clinton. It's a federal crime. People go to prison for it. He pulled out a video clip transcript, the text showing her exact words from a press conference. When you were asked about wiping the server, you said, and I quote, wiped, like with a cloth or something. And then you laughed. He set down the transcript, the paper landing softly on the desk. 33,000 emails subpoenaed by Congress, destroyed with BleachBit and hammers, and you laughed about it. The chamber remained silent. The Democratic senators who had been beaming an hour ago now staring at their desks, their faces pale. The media gallery had stopped typing. Journalists simply watching the systematic dismantling unfold, too captivated to take notes, knowing that every word was being recorded anyway. Vance gathered the email documents, organizing them back into their folder with the neatness of a librarian. You lectured me about judgment, about qualifications, about fitness for office. But you compromised classified information and destroyed evidence under subpoena. You treated national security like an inconvenience and the rule of law like a joke. And you've never faced any consequences for it. He set aside the folder and reached for the next one, the movement causing Hillary's hands to clench involuntarily. Why do you think that is, Mrs. Clinton? Why do you think ordinary Americans go to prison for mishandling classified information, but you walk free? He let the question hang in the air for a moment, the silence stretching until it became uncomfortable. Could it be that there's one set of rules for the Clintons and another set for everyone else? He opened the next folder, the tab labeled Foundation in neat handwriting. Let's talk about how you got rich from public service. If you enjoyed this dramatic confrontation and want to see more deep dives into political power plays and the moments that shattered carefully constructed legacies, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. These are the stories the establishment doesn't want told, presented with all the documentation laid bare. Don't miss the next one. Hillary Clinton had spent decades building walls around her scandals, creating layers of lawyers and friendly media and loyal defenders who would rush to her aid whenever the questions got too pointed. She had survived Whitewater, Travelgate, the Rose law firm billing records, her husband's impeachment, the vast right-wing conspiracy that she had conjured to explain every accusation. Every time she had emerged battered but intact, convinced that she was too big, too important, too protected to be held accountable for anything. But Vance wasn't attacking her walls. He was methodically documenting what was behind them, brick by brick, fact by fact, document by document. The Clinton Foundation. Vance began, spreading financial records across his desk in a careful arrangement that told a story of its own. A charitable organization established by your husband after his presidency, officially dedicated to improving global health, fighting climate change, promoting economic development. He pulled out financial statements, the columns of numbers stark and damning in their clarity. Between 2001 and 2015, the Clinton Foundation raised approximately $2 billion, $2 billion, from individuals, corporations, and foreign governments around the world. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the chamber before settling back on her. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with a charitable foundation raising money, but the timing of some of these donations raises questions. Vance spread documents across his desk in a careful arrangement, each one connected to the next by invisible threads of influence and access. You became Secretary of State in January 2009. You were responsible for American foreign policy, including relationships with foreign governments. And during your tenure as Secretary of State, the Clinton Foundation received millions of dollars from those same governments. He held up a list, the names of countries printed in bold, the amounts staggering in their magnitude. Saudi Arabia, $10 to $25 million. A country where women couldn't drive, where homosexuality is punishable by death, where dissidents are tortured and murdered. They gave your foundation up to $25 million while you were Secretary of State. He continued down the list, each name a nail in the coffin of her reputation. The United Arab Emirates $1 to $5 million, Kuwait $5 to $10 million, Qatar $1 to $5 million, Oman $1 to $5 million, all while you were the chief diplomat of the United States, all while these countries had business before your department. Vance sat down the list and looked at Hillary, his expression still neutral, still factual, but the weight of his gaze heavy with accusation. You lectured me earlier about women's rights. You called my positions prehistoric, but you took tens of millions of dollars from governments that execute women for adultery, that stone women to death for being raped, that treat women as property. He pulled out more documents, bank records and wire transfer receipts. And it wasn't just the foundation. Your husband's speaking fees increased dramatically while you were Secretary of State. Bill Clinton received $500,000 from a Russian bank for a single speech, while your department was reviewing the sale of American uranium to Russia. He received $750,000 from a Swedish company with business pending before your department. Vance held up a chart showing the progression of speaking fees over time, the line graph rising steeply during her tenure at State. Before you became Secretary of State, Bill Clinton's average speaking fee was approximately $150,000. During your tenure, it jumped to over $500,000, but only for speeches to entities with interests before the State Department. When you left office, the fees dropped back down. He let that fact breathe for a moment, the implication hanging in the air like smoke. That's not coincidence, Mrs. Clinton. That's a pricing structure. Access to the Secretary of State cost $500,000 per speech. Hillary's voice was tight, defensive, the first cracks showing in her facade. My husband's speaking career has nothing to do with my official duties. They are completely separate. Let's talk about Uranium One. Vance interrupted, pulling out a thick document that made Hillary's face go even paler, the blood draining until she looked almost ghost-like under the fluorescent lights. This was dangerous territory, the scandal that had dogged her for years but never quite broken through the media's protective barrier. In 2010, the Russian nuclear agency Rosatom sought to acquire Uranium One, a Canadian company that controlled approximately 20% of American uranium production. The sale required approval from multiple U.S. agencies, including the State Department. He held up financial records, the paper trail clear and damning. During the period when this sale was being reviewed and approved, investors in Uranium One donated approximately $145 million to the Clinton Foundation. $145 million. Vance set down the records and pulled out more documents. Bill Clinton received $500,000 for a speech in Moscow paid by a Russian bank with ties to the Kremlin, while this sale was pending, while your department was reviewing it. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried to every corner of the chamber. The State Department approved the sale. Russia now controls 20% of American uranium production, and the people involved in that sale gave your foundation $145 million. His voice hardened, the first hint of emotion breaking through his controlled demeanor. You called me a puppet earlier. You suggested I do what I'm told, but you literally sold access to the State Department. You took millions from foreign governments while you were making decisions that affected them. You approved a sale that benefited Russia while Russians were writing checks to your foundation. He gathered the foundation documents, organizing them with the same methodical care. Who's the puppet, Mrs. Clinton? Who's been bought and paid for? The Democratic senators looked stricken, their faces pale, their eyes averted. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Hillary was supposed to be destroying Vance, not the other way around. But Vance had turned her own attacks back on her, using her condescension as an opening to present devastating documentation that couldn't be spun away. Vance reached for another folder, the tab reading women in his neat handwriting. Now, let's talk about how you've treated women. Hillary's expression hardened, her jaw tightening, her eyes narrowing. This was personal territory, the contradiction at the heart of her public image that she had spent decades trying to manage. She had presented herself as a champion of women for decades, the feminist icon who would break the glass ceiling and empower girls around the world. But the women who had accused her husband told a very different story, one that threatened to unravel the carefully constructed narrative of her as a defender of female dignity. Mrs. Clinton, you called me a misogynist. You said my positions on women's rights are prehistoric. You've presented yourself throughout your career as a champion of women, a feminist icon, a defender of those who have been victimized. He pulled out documents, the pages filled with testimony and quotes and investigative reports. So, let's talk about how you've actually treated women, specifically the women who accused your husband of sexual misconduct. Hillary's voice cut through the chamber, sharp and defensive. My husband is not on trial here. No, he's not. Vance agreed, his voice calm but firm. You are, because you weren't a passive bystander to his behavior. You were an active participant in the effort to silence and destroy his accusers. He held up the first document, the name Monica Lewinsky printed across the top. Monica Lewinsky, a 22-year-old White House intern who had a sexual relationship with your husband, the President of the United States. According to multiple sources, including leaked conversations, you called her a narcissistic Looney Tune. Vance looked up, his gaze meeting hers. A young woman barely out of college, targeted by the most powerful man in the world. And you called her a narcissistic Looney Tune. He moved to the next document, Jennifer Flowers. She came forward during the 1992 campaign with evidence of a long-term affair with Bill Clinton. Your campaign's response was to attack her credibility, to dig up dirt on her past, to destroy her reputation. Later, under oath, your husband admitted the affair. But by then, Jennifer Flowers had been publicly humiliated. He continued methodically through the list, each name a chapter in a history of destruction. Paula Jones. She alleged that Bill Clinton had sexually harassed her when he was governor of Arkansas. Your team's response was the same. Attack, discredit, destroy. James Carville, your close ally, said, drag a $100 bill through a trailer park. You never know what you'll find. That was how your team talked about a woman who accused your husband of harassment. Vance's voice grew harder, the emotion finally breaking through his controlled facade. Kathleen Willey, a White House volunteer who alleged that Bill Clinton had groped her in the Oval Office. After she came forward, she was subjected to an orchestrated campaign of intimidation. Her tires were slashed. Her cat was killed. A stranger approached her while she was jogging and asked about her children by name. He set down the documents, his hands resting on the desk. And then there's Juanita Broaddrick. The name hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, the silence that followed it heavy with implication. Juanita Broaddrick has alleged consistently for over 40 years that Bill Clinton raped her in 1978 when he was Attorney General of Arkansas. She says he bit her lips so hard they bled. She says he told her to put ice on it afterward. Vance pulled out Broaddrick's public statement, the words stark and brutal in their simplicity. She also says that several weeks later, You approached her at a campaign event. She says you grabbed her hand and said, "I just want you to know how much Bill and I appreciate everything you do for us." She says you squeezed her hand painfully and looked her in the eye. She says it was a clear threat. He looked directly at Hillary, his gaze unwavering. "Did you threaten Juanita Broderick, Mrs. Clinton?" Hillary's voice was ice, her composure cracking to reveal the steel beneath. "That allegation has been investigated, and I didn't ask if it was investigated." Vance interrupted, his voice cutting through her response. "I asked if you threatened her. Did you approach a woman who alleged that your husband raped her and send her a message to stay quiet?" Silence. Vance let the silence stretch. Let the question echo through the chamber. Let the weight of the accusation settle over the room like dust. Then he continued, his voice softer now but no less powerful. "You've built your public image on being a champion of women. You've said believe all women. But when women accused your husband, you didn't believe them. You attacked them. You hired private investigators to dig up dirt on them. You ran what your own team called a bimbo eruptions operation to silence them." He gathered the documents, the stack thick with the weight of destroyed lives. "That's not feminism, Mrs. Clinton. That's complicity. You enabled your husband's behavior for decades. You helped destroy the women who tried to hold him accountable. And then you had the audacity to present yourself as a champion of women's rights." He set aside the folder, the sound of paper on wood loud in the silence. "You called me a misogynist, but I've never attacked a rape victim. I've never hired private investigators to destroy women who accused someone of harassment. I've never threatened a woman to keep her quiet about sexual assault." He looked directly at her, his gaze holding hers until she had to look away, had to break the contact, had to find somewhere else to focus. "You have, and everyone watching now knows it." The chamber was suffocating in its silence, the air thick with the weight of what had been revealed. Hillary sat motionless, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. The confident smirk she had worn at the beginning of the hearing was long gone. In its place was something she rarely showed in public: raw, undisguised fear. Vance reached for his final major folder, the tab reading 2016 in his neat handwriting. "Let's talk about 2016. Hillary shifted in her seat, the movement involuntary, a physical reaction to the mention of the wound that had never healed. This was the election she had been supposed to win, the presidency she had been denied, the humiliation she had never fully processed or accepted. In 2016, you ran for president against Donald Trump." Vance began, his voice returning to the factual, documentary tone he had maintained throughout. "You had every advantage. More money, more endorsements, more media support, more experience. By every conventional measure, you should have won." He pulled out documents, poll numbers and financial reports and media coverage analyses. "But you didn't win. You lost. And according to your own book, what happened, you've never taken responsibility for that loss." He held up a list, the pages filled with her own words from the book. "In your book, you blamed Russia, James Comey, the FBI, Bernie Sanders, the media, sexism, voter suppression, fake news, WikiLeaks, and the vast right-wing conspiracy. You had an explanation for everything except your own failures." He set down the list, the paper landing with a soft thud. "Let's start with how you talked about the voters. On September 9, 2016, at a fundraiser in New York City, you said this about Trump supporters." Vance read from the transcript, his voice taking on a mocking tone that wasn't quite his own, an imitation of her cadence and accent. "You could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables, right? The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it." He looked up, his gaze sweeping the chamber before settling back on her. "You called tens of millions of Americans deplorables, irredeemable, beyond hope, beyond redemption." His voice took on a personal edge, the first time his own emotions had clearly entered his presentation. "I grew up with those people, Mrs. Clinton, the people you called deplorables. They're not racists. They're not irredeemable. They're Americans who work hard, love their families, and felt abandoned by politicians like you. Politicians who look down on them, who dismiss their concerns, who treat them with contempt." Vance pulled out more documents, maps and schedules and travel logs. "And your contempt showed in your campaign. You didn't visit Wisconsin once during the general election. Not once. a state that had voted Democratic in every presidential election since 1988. You took it for granted. You lost it by 23,000 votes. He continued, the facts landing like blows. You barely visited Michigan. You lost it by 11,000 votes. You didn't take Pennsylvania seriously until it was too late. You lost it by 44,000 votes. He set down the documents, the geographical maps showing the Rust Belt states in stark red. 3 states. Fewer than 80,000 votes combined. That's the margin that cost you the presidency. And you lost those votes because you were too arrogant to show up. Because you thought you didn't need working-class voters in the Rust Belt. Because you called them deplorables and expected them to vote for you anyway. Vance pulled out one more document, and Hillary felt her breath catch, her chest tightening with the recognition of what he held. She knew what it was. She had prayed he wouldn't go there, that he would stick to the scandals everyone already knew about, that he wouldn't bring up the thing that had started it all. And then there's the Steele dossier. The words fell like stones into still water, the ripples spreading outward to touch every corner of the chamber. During the 2016 campaign, your campaign and the Democratic National Committee paid over $1 million to a law firm called Perkins Coie. Perkins Coie hired a company called Fusion GPS. Fusion GPS hired a former British spy named Christopher Steele to compile opposition research on Donald Trump. That research became known as the Steele dossier. He held up the dossier, the document thick with salacious allegations and unverified claims. It contains sensational allegations about Trump, allegations that have never been verified and many of which have been actively disproven. Vance's voice was relentless, the documentation overwhelming in its thoroughness. But here's what matters. Your campaign paid for this. And then this dossier, this opposition research paid for by your campaign, was used to obtain FISA warrants to surveil American citizens. It was fed to the media before the election. It became the foundation of the Russia collusion narrative that dominated American politics for 4 years. He set down the dossier, his gaze never leaving her face. The primary source for much of the dossier, a man named Igor Danchenko, was later charged with lying to the FBI about where his information came from. The FBI knew there were problems with the dossier and used it anyway. The entire Russia collusion narrative was built on garbage that your campaign paid for. Vance gathered all the 2016 documents, organizing them back into their folder with the same methodical care he had shown throughout. You accused me of being Trump's puppet. You questioned my principles. But you paid for fake opposition research and then watched as it was used to spy on American citizens and delegitimize an election. You've spent years promoting a narrative you helped create with paid political dirt. He looked at Hillary, his expression finally showing something other than neutrality. A sadness, perhaps, or a disappointment. That's not principle, Mrs. Clinton. That's propaganda, and you've never been held accountable for it. Vance walked to the front of the dais for his conclusion, his footsteps echoing in the silent chamber like drumbeats. The room was so quiet that the sound of his breathing was audible, the rustle of his papers like thunder. Mrs. Clinton, you came here today to lecture me about experience, about judgment, about qualifications for high office. You've been doing this for 40 years. Lecturing, condescending, explaining to everyone else how things should be done. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the chamber before settling back on Hillary, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her want to look away but couldn't. So let's review your experience. Let's see what 40 years of Hillary Clinton has actually produced. He raised one finger, the gesture clear and simple. Benghazi, 4 Americans dead because your department denied their security requests. You knew the night of the attack that it was terrorism. You wrote it in an email to your daughter. And then you looked grieving parents in the eye and blamed a YouTube video. You lied to the families of the dead. A second finger joined the first. The emails. You compromised classified information, including top-secret information on an unsecured private server. When you were subpoenaed, you destroyed evidence. You had your staff use bleachbit and hammers to ensure the emails couldn't be recovered. Anyone else would be in prison. You laughed about it. A third finger joined the others, the foundation. You took tens of millions of dollars from foreign governments while you were Secretary of State. You took money from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, from regimes that execute women for being raped. Your husband's speaking fees doubled when entities had business before your department. You sold access to American foreign policy. A fourth finger, Bill's accusers. You presented yourself as a champion of women while spending decades destroying women who accused your husband. You called Monica Lewinsky a narcissistic Looney Tune. You ran a bimbo eruptions team to silence victims. You allegedly threatened a woman who said your husband raped her. Fifth finger completing the count. 2016. You called working-class Americans deplorables and irredeemables. You were too arrogant to campaign in states you needed to win. You paid for fake opposition research that was used to spy on American citizens. And when you lost, you blamed everyone but yourself. Vance lowered his hand, the gesture final and complete. That's your experience, Mrs. Clinton. That's your 40 years in public life. Scandal after scandal, failure after failure. And never, not once, have you taken responsibility for any of it. He walked closer to the witness table, his steps slow and deliberate, giving each word its full weight. You asked me what I know about foreign policy. I know enough not to get 4 Americans killed and then lie about why. I know enough not to compromise classified information on a server in my basement. I know enough not to take money from governments that stone women to death. His voice grew stronger, the emotion finally breaking through completely, not anger but something else. Conviction, righteousness, the certainty of a man who knows he is speaking truth to power. You asked about my qualifications. I'm qualified enough not to destroy evidence under subpoena. I'm qualified enough not to sell access to the highest bidder. I'm qualified enough not to blame everyone else when I fail. He looked directly into her eyes, the contact unbreakable now, the moment frozen in time. You called me inexperienced, but your experience is 40 years of scandal, corruption, and failure. That's not a qualification, Mrs. Clinton. That's a warning. You called me a hypocrite for changing my views on Trump, but I changed my views openly. I didn't hide it. I explained why. You've spent 40 years hiding evidence, destroying documents, and attacking anyone who questions you. You called me a puppet, but you're the one who sold access to foreign governments. You're the one whose husband's speaking fees depended on what your department was reviewing. You're the one who's been bought and paid for by every special interest with a checkbook. You called me a misogynist, but you're the one who destroyed women to protect your husband's career. You're the one who called a 22-year-old intern a Looney Tune. You're the one who allegedly threatened a rape victim. Vance straightened, his posture perfect, his presence filling the chamber. You came here today to destroy me, Mrs. Clinton, to remind everyone why you should have been president, to prove that you're still the most formidable figure in American politics. He shook his head slowly, the gesture conveying not triumph but sorrow. But all you've done is remind everyone why they didn't vote for you, why they don't trust you. Why 40 years of Hillary Clinton has left a trail of scandals, lies, and failures that you've never been held accountable for. His voice dropped lower, more intense, the words carrying to every corner of the room and through the cameras to millions of viewers beyond. Some people spent 40 years enriching themselves, covering up scandals, destroying anyone who got in their way, and then demanding that America make them president. Those people are you. And today, finally, everyone watching gets to see the full record, not the carefully curated image, not the media-friendly version, the truth. He returned to his seat, the movement graceful and unhurried. I yield my time. The chamber sat in stunned silence, the kind of silence that follows a thunderclap, heavy and complete. For perhaps the first time in her 40-year public career, Hillary Clinton had been comprehensively, systematically dismantled. Not by partisan accusations, but by her own record, documented and presented with devastating thoroughness. She sat motionless at the witness table, the color drained from her face, her skin pale and waxy under the fluorescent lights. Her hands, usually so animated when she spoke, lay flat on the table, trembling slightly, the tremor visible to the cameras and the spectators. Her staff surrounded her, whispering urgently, trying to get her attention, trying to prepare her for what came next. But she didn't seem to hear them. She was staring at nothing, her eyes unfocused, as if she were watching her entire legacy burn in real time, the flames consuming everything she had built over 4 decades of careful construction. In the gallery, Bill Clinton sat with his jaw clenched, his face flushed with impotent rage, his hands gripping the railing in front of him until his knuckles were white. He had watched many attacks on his wife over the years. He had helped her survive them, had orchestrated the defenses and the counterattacks and the media strategies that had kept them in power despite everything. But this was different. This wasn't an attack. It was an autopsy. It was the careful dissection of 40 years of carefully constructed lies, laid out on the table for everyone to see. And there was no defense against the truth when it was presented with such devastating clarity. The Democratic senators who had been so eager to see Hillary destroy Vance were now looking at their phones, at their papers, at anything except the witness table where their champion sat broken and defeated. There was nothing to say, no spin that could undo what had just happened. The documentation was there. The emails were real. The financial records were real. The testimony of the families was real. You couldn't spin away reality when it was displayed on screens for the entire nation to see. When the document spoke louder than any talking points or deflections, Chairman Menendez attempted to restore normalcy, his voice strained and cracking with the effort. "We'll take a 15-minute recess." No, Hillary's voice was hoarse, barely recognizable as her own, the sound of someone who had been screaming though she had not made a sound. "I have a response." The room went quiet, every eye turning back to her, the spectacle of the defeated trying to rally holding a morbid fascination. She leaned into her microphone, her hands trembling visibly now, a sight no one had ever witnessed before. Hillary Clinton never trembled. She was steel. She was ice. She was the woman who never broke, until now. "Mr. Vice President, you've delivered quite a prosecution. Very thorough, very well prepared. I can see why you went to Yale Law School." She attempted a smile. It looked like a grimace, the rictus of someone in pain trying to pretend they were fine. "But everything you've said has been said before. I've faced these accusations for decades. I've been investigated by Congress, by the FBI, by special prosecutors. And I'm still here. Because the accusations don't hold up. Because they're politically motivated. Because Mrs. Clinton." Vance's voice was quiet but firm, cutting through her words like a scalpel through tissue. "I didn't make accusations. I read documents, your emails, your foundation's financial records, your campaign's FEC filings, the FBI's report, the congressional testimony." He held up the folders, the stack thick with the weight of evidence. "These aren't accusations. They're your own words, your own actions, your own record. If you have an explanation for any of it, an actual explanation, not a deflection, I'm happy to hear it." Hillary stared at him, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish gasping on land. Vance's voice remained steady, the questions simple and direct. "Why did you tell your daughter it was Al-Qaeda the night of Benghazi, and then tell the American people it was a YouTube video?" Silence. "Why did you destroy 33,000 emails after they were subpoenaed?" Silence. "Why did the Clinton Foundation accept tens of millions from Saudi Arabia while you were Secretary of State?" Silence. "Why did your husband's speaking fees double for entities with business before your department?" Silence. "Why did you approach Juanita Broderick at that campaign event if she was lying?" Silence. Vance set down the folders with finality, the sound like a period at the end of a sentence. "You've spent 40 years avoiding these questions, Mrs. Clinton, deflecting, blaming your accusers, claiming it's all political, but you've never actually answered them. You've never explained the documents. You've never taken responsibility." He looked at her with something that might have been pity, the expression of a man who understood the weight of what he had done. "And now everyone watching knows why. There are no good answers. There's only the record, and the record is damning." Hillary opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. She opened it again. Nothing came out. The most practiced speaker in American politics, the woman who had given thousands of speeches and survived hundreds of hostile interviews, had no words, no deflections, no explanations, no escape. After a long moment that stretched into eternity, she gathered her papers slowly, mechanically, like someone moving through water, her movements stiff and jerky. Her staff moved to help her rise from the table, their hands under her elbows, supporting her weight as if she were an elderly woman, rather than the formidable political force she had been just hours before. The protective entourage that had swept into the chamber 3 hours ago now formed a defensive perimeter, shielding her from the cameras as she walked toward the exit, her head down, her eyes on the floor. No one asked questions. What was there to ask? The documents spoke for themselves. The truth had been told. As she passed the dais, Vance was organizing his folders, speaking quietly with an aide, his demeanor calm and professional, as if he had just finished a routine meeting rather than the destruction of a political dynasty. He looked up as Hillary passed, their eyes meeting across the space of the chamber for one final time. "I'm sorry it had to be this way, Mrs. Clinton," he said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear, the words carrying no malice, only a genuine regret. "But you attacked my family, my background, my integrity. You opened the door. I just walked through it." Hillary said nothing. She kept walking, her face a mask of control that couldn't hide the devastation in her eyes, her staff forming a tight circle around her as they moved toward the exit. She didn't stop until she was in her car, the black SUV with tinted windows that shielded her from the cameras that had captured every moment of her humiliation, the vehicle pulling away from the Capitol with a soft purr of the engine. Only then, alone in the back seat as the car navigated the streets of Washington, surrounded by tinted glass and the soft leather of luxury that suddenly felt like a prison, did she allow herself to understand what had happened. For 40 years she had believed she was untouchable, too powerful, too connected, too important. Every scandal had been weathered, every investigation had been survived, every accuser had been discredited or ignored. The machine she and Bill had built, the network of donors and media allies and political operatives, was supposed to protect them from everything. But the documents had always been there. The emails, the financial records, the testimony from the families of the dead, the women her husband had abused, waiting for someone willing to compile them, organize them, present them without fear of the Clinton machine. J.D. Vance hadn't been afraid. He had prepared methodically, waited patiently, and struck devastatingly. He had done what 40 years of opponents had failed to do. He had held her accountable. And now her legacy, the carefully constructed narrative of Hillary Clinton, feminist icon, foreign policy expert, most qualified candidate ever, lay in ruins around her like the rubble of a collapsed building. Her phone began buzzing with messages, the screen lighting up with names she had known for decades, allies and donors and friends who suddenly had urgent business elsewhere. She turned it off. She couldn't face it yet. She couldn't face any of it. The video went viral within hours. 20 million views by midnight, 50 million by the next morning, 120 million views in the first 48 hours. The Reckoning, as the media quickly dubbed it, became the most watched congressional hearing in American history, surpassing even the Watergate hearings in viewership and cultural impact. Clips were shared across every platform. The moments Vance held up the email to Chelsea, the list of foreign donations to the Clinton Foundation, the names of the women Bill had assaulted, the confrontation about the destroyed emails. Each clip had millions of views on its own, shared by people who had never paid attention to politics before, who didn't know about Benghazi or Uranium One or the Bimbo Eruptions team, who were seeing the documented truth for the first time. Analysis pieces flooded the internet, written by journalists and historians and political scientists trying to make sense of what had happened. Conservative outlets celebrated the exposure of Clinton corruption they had been documenting for decades, the vindication of their long-held beliefs. Liberal outlets scrambled to defend Hillary, but their defenses sounded hollow when viewers could simply watch the hearing and see the documents for themselves, when the evidence was there in black and white and color video, undeniable and unspinnable. The phrase 40 years of failure became a meme, shared across social media with images of Hillary's face draining of color as Vance presented each new folder. The contrast between her confident attack at the beginning and her silent, defeated exit at the end was played on loop. The before and after that told the whole story. The political fallout was swift and comprehensive, a tidal wave that swept away everything in its path. Within 48 hours, 3 major Democratic donors announced they were distancing themselves from the Clintons, their statements carefully worded but their meaning clear. Within a week, that number had grown to 20, then 50, then 100, the floodgates opened by the undeniable documentation of corruption and dishonesty. The Clinton Foundation, already diminished since 2016, saw its remaining donors flee like rats from a sinking ship. Board members resigned quietly, citing scheduling conflicts and family commitments. Their departures announced in press releases that avoided any mention of the hearing. Major partners announced they were ending their relationships with the organization, their contracts terminated or allowed to expire without renewal. Within weeks, the foundation announced it was scaling back operations and refocusing its mission, the euphemisms transparent to anyone paying attention. Within months, it was effectively dormant. The massive apparatus that had raised $2 billion over 15 years reduced to a skeleton staff managing the slow process of dissolution. The remaining funds dispersed to other charities in an attempt to avoid further scrutiny. The Clinton Foundation, once the most powerful philanthropic organization in the world, a vehicle for influence and access that had shaped global policy and domestic politics, was dead. Democratic politicians who had spent decades cultivating Clinton relationships suddenly discovered urgent scheduling conflicts when asked to appear with her. The invitations to party events dried up, the calls stopping coming, the emails going unanswered. The requests for endorsement stopped coming, the candidates who had once begged for her blessing now finding other mentors to guide their careers. Hillary Clinton's famous network, built over 40 years of favors and fundraisers and political IOUs, dissolved almost overnight, the connections that had seemed permanent and unbreakable proving to be as fragile as spider silk when the money stopped flowing and the power evaporated. The people who had claimed to be her closest allies were suddenly unavailable, their phones going to voicemail, their assistants offering excuses. The politicians who had praised her publicly were silent, their social media accounts posting about other topics, their interviews avoiding any mention of her name. The media figures who had defended her for decades moved on to other stories, their attention spans short, their loyalty purchased rather than earned. The speaking circuit dried up completely. The invitations that had once commanded hundreds of thousands of dollars per speech now non-existent. Universities that had competed for the prestige of hosting her suddenly had other priorities. Corporations that had paid fortunes for her wisdom found other speakers. Advocacy groups that had lined up to hear her voice discovered other causes to champion. Within a month of the hearing, every scheduled speech was quietly canceled, the contracts bought out or allowed to lapse. New invitations stopped coming entirely, the phone that had once rang constantly now silent and dead. The boards and commissions that had been eager to add Hillary's name to their letterhead quietly removed her, their websites updated to erase her presence, their annual reports reprinted without her photo. The consulting contracts were terminated, the advisory positions eliminated, the prestigious appointments evaporated like morning mist in sunlight. The elder stateswoman's status she had cultivated since 2016, the image of the wise grandmother of the Democratic Party offering counsel to the next generation, disappeared like it had never existed. She had envisioned herself as a respected voice on foreign policy, a sage advisor to the next generation of Democratic leaders, the keeper of the flame who would guide the party through the Trump era and into a new progressive future. Instead, she became radioactive, a cautionary tale, a symbol of everything voters distrusted about political dynasties and establishment corruption. The name Clinton, once a brand that opened doors and commanded respect, became toxic, associated not with progress and competence but with scandal and dishonesty and the arrogance of power. 2 weeks after the hearing, Hillary Clinton released a statement through her office, the words carefully crafted by lawyers and PR consultants who understood that nothing could undo the damage but that silence would be worse. I'm proud of my 40 years of public service and stand by my record. I will continue to advocate for the causes I believe in. But she made no public appearances. She granted no interviews. She had nothing left to say. What could she say? The documents were real. The emails were real. The foundation donations were real. The lies to the families were real. No amount of spin could change that. No amount of deflection could undo what had been seen by millions. Bill Clinton, never one to stay silent when attacked, attempted a defense on a Sunday talk show 3 weeks after the hearing. It went poorly. The host, sensing blood in the water, simply played clips from the hearing and asked for explanations. Why did Hillary tell Chelsea it was Al-Qaeda and tell the families it was a video? Bill rambled about the fog of war and evolving intelligence assessments, his famous verbal dexterity failing him for the first time in his career. He sounded defensive, evasive, old, a shadow of the politician who had once been called the comeback kid. What about the 33,000 deleted emails? Bill claimed they were personal emails about yoga routines and Chelsea's wedding, the same talking points that had failed years ago. The host pointed out that destroying evidence under subpoena was a crime regardless of what was in the emails. Bill had no response, his face flushing red, his hands trembling. The Clinton Foundation received $145 million from Uranium One investors while the sale was being reviewed. How do you explain that? Bill grew flustered, insisting there was no quid pro quo, that the timing was coincidental, that the donations had nothing to do with the approval. But he couldn't explain why investors in a pending deal would donate such massive sums to his foundation. He couldn't explain why his speaking fees had doubled during Hillary's time at state, why the money flowed in when the decisions were being made and dried up when she left office. The interview was a disaster. Clips of Bill's stammering non-answers going viral alongside clips of the original hearing, the two performances reinforcing each other. The collapse of the Clinton dynasty documented in high definition for posterity. If anything, his attempted defense made things worse, reminding everyone of his own history of lies and cover-ups, his own scandals and impeachment, his own pattern of behavior that had enabled everything Hillary had done. After that, Bill stopped trying to defend Hillary publicly. The famous Clinton partnership, the 2-for-1 deal that had defined their political marriage and captivated the nation for decades, was over. They had survived scandals before by presenting a united front, by attacking their accusers together, by spinning and deflecting until the media moved on to the next story. But this time, there was no united front to present. The evidence was too comprehensive. The documentation was too thorough. The lies were too obvious when laid out in sequence with the corresponding documents. The Clintons retreated to Chappaqua, their compound in upstate New York that had once been the center of the political universe, the place where presidents and prime ministers came to pay homage, where donors wrote checks and made their wishes known, where the future of the Democratic Party was planned and plotted. Photographers occasionally captured them walking on their property or attending a local event, their images appearing in tabloids and on gossip websites, the public's appetite for their humiliation seemingly insatiable. They looked smaller, somehow diminished, the aura of power that had surrounded them for decades gone like a scent that had dissipated. They looked like what they had always been underneath the carefully constructed image. An aging couple whose time had passed, whose moment was over, whose legacy lay in ruins. Bill played golf at the local country club, though fewer people sought out his company than before. The foursomes that had once been filled with power brokers and celebrities, now populated by retired doctors and local businessmen who didn't care about his stories of the White House. Hillary tended her garden, the physical work a welcome distraction from thoughts she'd rather not think, the dirt under her fingernails a reminder of simpler things. Occasionally, old friends visited, though the visits grew less frequent as months passed, the invitations drying up as people realized that association with the Clintons was no longer an asset but a liability. They didn't talk about the hearing. They didn't talk about politics much at all. The television was usually tuned to old movies or cooking shows, anything but news, the voices of commentators who had once praised them now too painful to hear. The newspapers piled up unread, the headlines that would have once been analyzed and clipped now ignored. The phones rang less often, the silence of the house growing louder with each passing day. Sometimes late at night, when Bill was asleep and the house was quiet, Hillary walked to her study and looked at the photographs on the wall. Her with world leaders, Putin and Xi and Merkel and Netanyahu, their faces serious, the weight of nations on their shoulders. At the State Department standing behind the podium with the seal, the American flag behind her, her expression confident and commanding. At campaign rallies, surrounded by thousands of cheering supporters, their faces full of hope and belief. Their signs reading I'm with her and history made. A different life, a different Hillary, one who believed she was destined to be president, one who believed the rules were for other people, one who believed she would never be held accountable for anything. That Hillary was gone now. The hearing had killed her as surely as if Vance had fired a bullet through her carefully constructed persona, leaving only the shell of a woman who didn't know how to live without power and influence. What remained was an elderly woman in a big house, surrounded by memories of a power she no longer had and a legacy that lay in ruins. The photographs on the wall mocking her with images of a time when she had mattered. She told herself she was treated unfairly, that it was all political, that history would vindicate her, that future generations would see her as a pioneer who was destroyed by sexism and the fear of powerful women. But late at night, alone with her thoughts, staring at photographs of a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else, she knew the truth. The documents were real. The lies were real. The corruption was real. For 40 years she had gotten away with it, had convinced herself that she was special, that the rules didn't apply to her, that she was too important to be held accountable. And then one day she wasn't. One day someone stood up. Someone asked the questions. Someone presented the evidence. Someone spoke the truth. And the truth finally set everyone free. The truth set Patricia Smith free from 12 years of gaslighting about her son's death. The confirmation that she had been lied to, that her grief had been exploited, that her son's sacrifice had been dishonored by the very people who should have protected him. It set Monica Lewinsky free from decades of being portrayed as the villain instead of the victim. The acknowledgement that she had been a young woman destroyed by powerful people who cared nothing for her dignity or her future. It set the voters free from the fiction that the Clintons were somehow different from other corrupt politicians, that their scandals were manufactured by partisan enemies rather than documented reality, that the vast right-wing conspiracy was real rather than a convenient excuse for their own misconduct. And in a strange way, it set Hillary Clinton free, too. Free from the exhausting performance of pretending to be something she wasn't. Free from the constant effort to maintain an image that required lies upon lies to sustain, each one compounding the last until the structure was too fragile to stand. Free from the prison of her own ambition, the hunger for power that had consumed her life and destroyed her humanity. She couldn't see that yet, sitting in her study late at night, staring at photographs of a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else, the weight of her disgrace heavy on her shoulders. But perhaps someday she would understand that the hearing, as devastating as it was, as humiliating as it had been, was also a kind of liberation. Because the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than a lie. And after 40 years of lies, the truth had finally been told. In Washington, in newsrooms, in living rooms across America, people who had watched the hearing would remember where they were when they saw it. The way previous generations remembered where they were when Kennedy was shot, when the towers fell, when Obama was elected. They would remember the look on Hillary Clinton's face when Vance held up the email to Chelsea, the moment when the mask cracked and the fear showed through. They would remember the silence in the chamber when he asked why she lied to the families, the stillness so complete you could hear the air conditioning hum. They would remember her walking out defeated, surrounded by staff who could no longer protect her from her own record, her head down, her shoulders slumped, the most powerful woman in American politics reduced to a figure of pity and scorn. And they would remember the lesson that no one, no matter how powerful, no matter how connected, no matter how protected by media and money and influence, is truly above accountability. That the truth matters. That documents don't lie even when politicians do. That sometimes, just sometimes, someone stands up and says what needs to be said, presents what needs to be presented, asks what needs to be asked. And when they do, the world changes. The mighty fall. The truth wins. And justice, even if delayed by decades, even if denied by the powerful, eventually finds its way into the light. 3 hours. That's all it took. 3 hours to dismantle 40 years of carefully constructed mythology, to tear down the edifice of lies and spin and media protection that had shielded Hillary Clinton from consequences her entire adult life. 3 hours to expose what had been hiding in plain sight all along, the documents and emails and financial records that had always been there, waiting for someone with the courage to use them. 3 hours to prove that power without integrity is just a house of cards, impressive from a distance, but collapsing at the first strong wind. J.D. Vance had been that wind. A steady, methodical, devastating wind that had blown through the chamber and scattered the Clinton dynasty to the four corners of the earth. And Hillary Clinton's house of cards had fallen, not with a bang but with a whisper, not with defiance but with silence, not with honor but with the pathetic whimper of a bully who had finally met someone she couldn't intimidate. The end had come not with a revolution or an election or a scandal, but with a simple presentation of facts. And in that simplicity was a lesson that would echo through the ages. The truth is undefeated, and those who build their empires on lies should never forget it.